well, let me make a spreadsheet on which cereal. I'm gonna put like all the different ingredients. I'm gonna like I'll rate the taste, and like three
Uh,
hours later, you'll have an answer. That's ridiculous, right?
right.
But what if you are like choosing who to vote for or something?
Sure.
That's the kind of analysis that you need to do. What if your candidate is telling you things and you should you accept that as true information? Maybe not. Maybe this is where you need to critically think. You need to evaluate statements. You have to find out, like, are people trying to manipulate you?
Right.
Do they have some ulterior motive? Do they
Right.
want like your money? Do they want your vote at any expense? So there's a lot that goes into it. So that's what we talk about when we talk about critical thinking.
Of course, this platform is dedicated to inspiring and empower our listeners to live their best audacious lives ever. And I'm so excited to have you here with us today and deeply appreciate your presence on this transformative journey. Now, sharpening your critical thinking skills is akin to honing a sword, just as a finely tuned blade effortlessly cuts through its obstacles. Enhancing your critical thinking skills equips you to navigate life's complexities with clarity and wisdom. Our featured guest is Bo Bennett. He's a distinguished authority in the critical thinking and psychology space, boasting over 15 years of experience in the field. He's got a foundation of social psychology and a mission to cultivate critical thinking skills. Bo has penned numerous insightful books and is a highly sought after speaker. His profound insights on critical thinking perfectly align with this episode of today's podcast, where we explore the significance of logical reasoning and wise decision making in achieving audacious living. So now that we've got you all set up, let's turn our conversation to Bo. Enjoy. Hey, Bo, thank you for joining me here and hanging out with me on the Audacious Living podcast. I appreciate you taking the time like this, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great to be able to engage in conversations, really encourage people to kind of live that best audacious life that we talk about here. And there's all sorts of pathways to get there, and all sorts of things people can do to get them, that people can do for themselves to get to that better place, if you will. Certainly, critical thinking is a big part of the work that you do in helping people to sort of analyze and critically look at their steps a lot more closer and with intention, I would imagine. And so maybe as a starting point, we can get you to certainly introduce yourself to our audience and tell us about the work that you've done to get you to this point now.
Sure. Well, my name is Bo Bennett, and I've been doing a lot of work with critical thinking, mostly in the past, probably like 15 to 20 years.
Mhm.
Prior to that, I did marketing, and I'm always doing business. Business is part of like everything I do. So I really have like my hands in a lot of different pots, if you will, academically and in the business world. I have a PhD in social psychology, so that's my academic background.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of crossover with psychology in general, plus philosophy and critical thinking, logic, reason. It's all related. So my focus on psychology is really the cognitive aspects of psychology, what makes us believe and think certain ways, how we can make better decisions. So that's what I've really been focusing on. That's kind of my life goal, to focus in that direction. If you look at all my books, most of my books focus on those categories, on
Right.
those topics, in addition to a book that I've written on success in general. Back in 2001, I sold my first huge company
Yeah.
for $20 million. So that was my big like financial win
Yeah.
that allowed me the opportunity to pursue my academic career and really focus on what I really wanted to do, and that was to help people think more critically.
Did you see that as sort of a gap, or why did you land there into critical thinking and helping people get there?
Well, it was kind of a like a happy accident, if you will. I was, like I mentioned, involved in business. I've always been interested in psychology. When I was 10 years old, I would work for my father from starting at the age of 10, and I would run these machines in our basement, these plastic injection molding machines. It was an incredibly monotonous job. So what I did is I got some of my sister and my mother's cassette tapes
Okay.
and listened to them, and they were cassette tapes of people like Zig Ziglar, Anthony Robbins,
Hmm.
Dennis Waitley, some of
Yep.
the motivational greats of the
Yep. Yep.
time.
Yep.
And I was completely hooked. So that's what really got me into psychology. But also, as you can imagine, it was a focus on business or focus on making money, success. And I knew that my if that was my main goal, I would have to pursue like a business career. So that's kind of how I started, but I always had that bug for psychology.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until, like I mentioned, probably like 15 years ago when I went back to school, got my degree in got my degree in psychology, general psychology, master's, and then ultimately the PhD in social psychology. And I was involved, I spent too much time online doing debating like way back.
Right.
It was just like wasting so much time. And
Yes.
that's what really got me pulled into the critical thinking because I started to realize that these arguments that I was seeing, they sounded really good. Like when I read
Right.
them, they seemed very convincing, but
Right.
clearly something was wrong with them because
Right.
the conclusions they were coming to were completely
Right.
and demonstrably false.
Right.
So like what's going on here?
Right.
And that's what completely fascinated me. So I was doing more research, looking into it, and then I started like, oh, there's these things called logical fallacies. Oh, there's a lot of cognitive biases. Oh, there's a lot of psychology that goes into this. There's a lot of manipulation techniques. There's a lot of persuasion techniques.
Right.
So all of this that's involved in communication was just completely fascinating to me. So I really wanted to jump into that. And it's not something you just learn and move on. It's a lifelong
Right.
process because there's so much involved.
Right. 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 Let's talk about critical thinking specifically, and not to be confused with negative thinking, because sometimes you think
Yeah.
critical, you think that's negative. It's more objective thinking. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, yeah, because you could say like I guess one could argue that all thinking is subjective, but in a sense that when you're thinking critically,
Hmm.
you're engaging your thinking process, and this is referred to as metacognition, thinking about your thinking. And this is what it really means to critically think, because there are some behavioral economists that wrote a book about the two different types of thinkings. They call system one thinking, system two.
Okay.
Most of us go through our lives, our average day with system one thinking, which is just automatic. It's we don't really put much thought into it. It's it's fast type of thinking. Like for example, if you're thinking, oh, well, what am I going to have for breakfast? Quick, should I have this, this cereal or this cereal? I'll take this one. Those kind of decisions that help us navigate life
Hmm.
in an efficient manner. There's nothing wrong with that. If it
Right.
weren't for this kind of fast thinking, we wouldn't be able to survive
Right.
as a species, right? We
Right.
wouldn't be able to navigate our world.
Right.
But then there's
Not,
also
not,
this
not
system.
everything involves big, long,
No,
thought out, drawn processes, right? Some
absolutely
decisions
not.
should be simple.
Right. So go back to my example with the cereal. Like if you said, okay, well, let me make a spreadsheet on which cereal I'm gonna put like all the different ingredients. I'm gonna like I'll rate the taste, and like three
Uh,
hours later you'll have an answer. That's ridiculous, right?
right.
But what if you are like choosing who to vote for or something?
Sure.
That's the kind of analysis that you need to do. What if your candidate is telling you things and you should you accept that as true information? Maybe not. Maybe this is where you need to critically think. You need to evaluate statements. You have to find out, like, are people trying to manipulate you?
Right.
Do they have some ulterior motive? Do they
Right.
want like your money? Do they want your vote at any expense? So there's a lot that goes into it. So that's what we talk about when we talk about critical thinking.
And then you said there's the system two. Want to describe that
That's
one?
the critical thinking.
Okay. Okay. I
That's
got you. Right.
right.
Right. So either you're one,
That's the
which is,
slow thinking.
I see, take your time, be methodical. consider other options, if you will. Those are all things that factor into that. So for some, because I mean, I've oftentimes heard you hear people talking. Well, I don't. They'll talk about, well, I don't think that way. I'm a this type of thinker, or that kind of thinker. Are you really saying though those are the only two that are out there in terms of where people fall into?
Well, we're just it's just like a binary distinction, but
Okay,
thinking, of course, is on the spectrum. Like you
gotcha.
can't say I
Okay,
either am critical thinking or not. You could have like degrees of critical thinking. You're like, oh,
gotcha,
I kind of thought about this a little bit,
gotcha.
versus like I really in depth thought about this. So it is technically a spectrum, but to understand it better, we often break things down into simplified categories, and I think that's what
Understood.
the authors that I referred to did in that case.
So the $1 million question is: if I'm not a critical thinker, how do I become one?
All right. Well, first you have to want to know the truth.
Right.
So
Okay.
this is probably the most important thing because you would think like, well, wait a minute, who doesn't want to know the truth, right? Who doesn't want to believe what's true? Well, the answer is a lot of people. The answer is people like to believe what makes them feel good.
Right.
Because when our beliefs are confirmed, we get this like little shot of adrenaline, this little
Hmm.
shot of endorphins
Yep.
that makes us feel good. Like, oh, this person believes what I do, therefore my beliefs are confirmed. I feel better about myself. When we get information that disagrees with our beliefs, it doesn't make us feel good. It makes us feel uncomfortable
Hmm.
because, oh, can we be wrong? If we're wrong about this, what else are we wrong about? Are we
Hmm.
stupid? Are we idiots?
Right.
And the answer is probably no. It's just like the thought pattern. But that's what we're talking about. And a lot of people will say, look, this makes me feel good. I'm very happy in this belief. Is it true? I don't know. It could be true, maybe not, but I like it. It makes me feel good. And sometimes some beliefs are so ingrained in the person's ideology who that person is. Like if you
Right.
say, if you ask somebody, who are you as a person? Tell me who you are.
Hmm.
They may say, like, they may talk about their religious beliefs. They may talk about their
Yes.
political beliefs or their social beliefs, like three main categories there, and that's who they are.
Right.
Those beliefs make up who they are. So once you do that, then it's incredibly difficult to change your mind on those beliefs, and your beliefs could be totally wrong,
Right.
right? But you're not going to do that because of the confirmation bias and a lot of other biases that we hold, and we don't like to be wrong about things. So first you have to realize that, or you have to come to the conclusion, you have to make the decision. I want to believe what's true, and virtually at any expense. Like I'm okay with that. The second thing you got to do is you have to do your best to get rid of the labels, right? Get rid of
Hmm.
your ideologies. Like
Mm.
anything that you're like incredibly feel strongly about, the chances are you probably aren't looking at the other side of that. Now, I'm not
Gotcha.
talking about like
Yes. Yeah.
I feel strongly that I shouldn't murder people. Like, I mean, there's really not an other side of that, right?
Right. Right. Right.
unless
Right.
you're unless you're arguing with psychopaths or something. I'm
Right.
talking about issues that are like generally opinion based and
Yep.
split down the middle, and you have different like whatever religions, different political
Hmm.
views,
Hmm. Hmm.
ideas on social issues. So those are the type of things where you really have to try to say, look, this is what I currently believe now because of the information that I've been given, because of the sources I've been reading, because how I was brought up, whatever. But if there is other information that will
Sure.
prove this like not true and it will make me even more right, why wouldn't you want that, right? So
Okay.
you have to have that openness and you have to have that willingness to kind of get those labels, stop being
Yes.
associate yourself with these labels and
Yep.
be a little bit more fluid in who you are,
Hmm.
and say, like, I am the type of person. If you want to know who I am the type of person who is flexible in my
Right.
beliefs, and
Mm.
I'm always following the evidence. And
Yep.
I want to be as right as possible. I want to believe as much true things as possible.
Yep.
That's the type of person I am.
Yep.
And
Yep.
leave it at that.
Well, it's so funny because and as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about how much our biases even can influence the evidence that we see, right? Like
Of
if I
course.
believe a certain thing and this is what it is, and that evidence, like two people look at a same scenario, and because of those biases, those things that I believe, that like because even as you were talking, for example, I was thinking about political parties, right? Like this is my political party, therefore everything we say this way is the way it is. Well, that's where our biases are kicking in. That's where they influence what we see, what we feel, what we believe, and then ultimately how we act. And so, really, really dangerous if you're not mindful of it. I'd say.
Right. Right, of course. And just one interesting thing about the whole idea of political parties is what are the chances that like everybody in one party would all agree on the exact same things? You
Right.
know, I mean, that's not how people think.
Right.
We probably have like strong issues, but then we're kind of groomed in a way to take a stance on whatever issue like your preferred party actually has. But when you're, but if you kind of disassociate yourself with the parties
Right.
and say, well, I want to look at each individual issue and then you could come to a different decision, you'll probably yeah be like more on one side than the other, but you'll find yourself agreeing and seeing the nuances in the arguments and understanding the different sides a lot better. And let me tell you this, when you do fully understand, like you could even take the issue that you might be most passionate about,
Hmm.
but when you do fully understand the other argument from the other side,
Right.
then you could much more effectively argue your position by understanding them. Because one, especially if you're the type of person that has like a natural level of empathy, you can empathize with them.
Sure.
You say, yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from on this
Yep.
issue.
Yep.
You mentioned this, and this. This is all true. Yes, I agree. And but have you considered these issues too? You know, and you could more you could talk to people in a more empathetic way, and you you could reason with them, and you could not just completely through the confirmation bias that
Mm.
we see so much in politics and just these like the crazy political speak, just completely ignore half the country, you know, and
Right.
their views
Right.
and ignore those arguments. It's more important to address them. So critical thinking could help you in many different ways, and that's just one more.
Tell me what logical fallacies. I heard you refer to that earlier, and I wanted to kind of come back to that. Because it's a term I'm not familiar with, so I'm curious.
Logical fallacies are essentially errors in reasoning. So they're either errors in the reasoning process, but they're also errors within argumentation, like the argument itself, the structure of the argument. And these go back to thousands of years ago. Socrates, Aristotle,
Hmm.
they were the initial people who wrote like some of these logical fallacies. So if you see some, a lot of them will be like have like Latin roots or Latin names
Okay.
for that reason. So they would look at these arguments, the structure of arguments, and they would say, okay, this is a problem. So like one of the most common logical fallacies uh, is the non sequitur, when when the conclusion is not justified by the premises.
Okay.
So the premises of the arguments are like, well, number one, this, number two, this, therefore that.
Right.
So that is the conclusion. But when you talk about the premises and the premises don't actually substantiate the conclusion, then you have yourself the non sequitur, which is the Latin name, or it doesn't follow essentially. So
Gotcha.
that is like the general category. So if you look at virtually any argument, there could be the reasons for the argument and then the conclusion. And if the reasons don't justify the conclusion, then you're looking at some kind of logical fallacy. And then there are like literally hundreds of types
Mm.
of logical fallacies
Right.
that you could kind of pinpoint. And it's interesting and certainly great to know all this stuff, but you don't need to. The bottom line is if you can like see an argument and evaluate the argument by realizing that the conclusion is not justified by the premises, then you're in great shape. You know,
Gotcha.
that's a wonderful start. And as you know the logical fallacies, it makes it easier to see that problem.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So as far as I was going to ask you, is there a rule of thumb in structuring a logical argument? I think you sort of touched on that a little bit of in terms of making sure there's a really a strong connection between the two, provided the fact that our biases have been checked, the evidence is proper. Like there's all these other
Right.
checkpoints that also have to be in place to make sure that we are structuring logical arguments.
Right, right. So, when you create like an argument, there's like a deductive argument they call it, and well, the deductive argument. Let me get to that first. The deductive is when if the premises are true, then the conclusion like must be true. So you
Right.
could say like I forgot the classic one, but I'm going to go over the example. And anyways, it's all about like if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And then there's also like the type of argument that could give you a true conclusion,
Okay.
but the premises could be false. So the if the premises are false and you don't have truth involved, then that's a problem as well. So you have like valid arguments.
Hmm.
There's a whole bunch of terms for all these things. It's
Got
a
you.
it's a interesting lesson in classical philosophy, but the thing is it gets really complicated, especially with a lot of the more deductive fallacies,
Okay.
and people will get overwhelmed. You don't need to know all that stuff.
Right.
Again, it's so important just to realize that if you could see the reasons for the argument, it may
Yes.
not be defined as official premises, but if you see the reasons and the reasons it just doesn't fit, the
Right.
conclusion does not fit, that's a great start.
Got you. Got you. And I remember my grandmother years ago. I remember her saying to me that common sense isn't common, and that's the expression that she always used, and I think it sort of fits nicely in terms of the way you are thinking. Really, what she's alluding to is the thinking pattern, the path that you took to get there. It's not consistent across everyone. I'm trying to find a nice way of saying this here. Not everyone's got it really is what we're saying, but the idea of taking the logic, like there's a logic path. So A to B to C, if it jumps to Z or Z at the end there, something's off, right? And so it's making sure there's a logical flow and reasoning from one statement or one argument to the next. Is that fair to
Right.
say?
Yeah, sure. And I want to touch on one thing that you said about the common sense,
Yep.
which is really funny. Yeah, common sense is not that common. That's a, a classical saying,
Mm-hmm.
and it's true. But logical fallacies will they're hidden within common sense. So when
Gotcha.
people say that they're using common sense, they are, but you have to go beyond that. You have to do more than common sense to find and pick these logical fallacies. And that's why they're so tricky. That's why these arguments are so tricky, because you'll see an argument and the common person using their common sense will
Mm-hmm.
say, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. That using common sense, but the problem is it's wrong. The conclusion is completely wrong, and it doesn't justify the conclusion.
Mm.
That's where you need to go deeper. You really need to use your
Okay.
critical thinking.
Right.
Critical common sense might be the level one, the system one that we were talking about, right?
Yes.
The kind of
Yes.
that's kind of our common sense,
Yes.
where system two goes beyond that.
Deeper. That's right. That's right. Awesome. Good point. That's a good point. So with all that we're talking about, Bo, tell me how it connects and relates to our individual success.
Well, as I mentioned, the ability to communicate is extremely important, pretty much in
Mm,
anything we do. There's, I guess, like with computers and the internet, it's a
yeah,
little bit easier to kind of seclude yourself and not have to communicate face to face, but
right.
there's still all that communication in one form or the other, whether it's text based or emails or other kind of writing. So communication is there and it always will be there. Of course, we have AI now to help us communicate better,
Hmm.
but that's really turning over an extremely important part of um, interaction to AI. I'm not comfortable doing that. Like I like to say exactly what I mean
Hmm.
in especially my written communications. So I don't feel comfortable like having AI rewrite it. In fact, it's funny. I've done that several times. I use like the standard. I've got Grammarly
Yep.
on my computer, and it makes these suggestions. And sometimes I said, "Yeah, go ahead, sure." And then I read it. I'm like, "That's not what I meant." It sounds good, grammatically, it's
Sure.
wonderful, but that's not
Sure.
what I meant. It
Sure.
changed the meaning. So critical thinking is
But also the tone. I mean, I know that's
the
not
tone is important too.
exactly
Yeah,
right. Like what we're also talking about, and I'm gonna let you finish because I want to go back in the conversation AI because I think it's very relevant.
right. So yeah, the tone. It's funny because I answer so many emails a day, and
Okay.
my tone is usually pretty short and kind of like just I get to the point right away, and a lot of people don't like that. They're like, "Oh,
I think
ew,
you're
this guy's a
AI.
jerk." Well, I don't think I'm a jerk, but I have so many emails to answer.
Right.
I just want to get people the information. Whereas if you go through like a customer service department, they'll say, "Well, hello,
That's
Mr.
right.
Bennett, Dr.
Yes.
Bennett, how
What
are
else
you
can we do
today?"
for you?
Yeah, yeah. What else can like I skip all of that. Whereas AI might clean it up for me and be a little bit friendly like that. So I could see the benefit there. But going back to your original question, like how does critical thinking
Yep.
uh, kind of help with all of this? Well, it helps you become a better communicator. Like I said, when you could truly use critical thinking to see the other person's point of view, and you could put yourself in their shoes. You could use empathy, you could use critical thinking to
Yep.
evaluate. No, we're not just talking about arguments, but we're talking about like anything that they say. Like, and I'm constantly dealing with customers who have questions and who have problems and
Sure.
concerns, and all of that is part of this. And then if you could understand that, you could communicate with them better when you see their perspective. But then
Gotcha.
there's also so many other elements of it, like not getting ripped off, like not falling for scams
Sure.
constantly. I mean,
Sure.
this is all critical thinking, making really good decisions in business, being able to properly evaluate the choices that you have. Should
Mm,
I start this business or should
right.
I start the other business? What should I do? These are huge decisions that all encompass critical thinking. And knowing your biases and knowing which biases you have helps you make these better decisions.
I want to sort of bring it back to the podcast specifically, if you will. So again, we talk about audacious living, and sometimes part of that making living that life of audacity means we're making some choices that are sometimes are unconventional, sometimes they're off the beaten path, sometimes they're made with no first, like you don't know what the next steps are,
Yeah.
and there's a whole aspect of being courageous enough or demonstrating the boldness to take those steps in light of lack of information, lack of data to analyze and critically think. Um, I wonder if you sort of talk about that connection and how those two relate to one another.
Yeah. So, if you can rephrase that question for me a
So,
little bit,
so, so oftentimes, really oftentimes so when we have the data to make decisions, so
right,
I should go down this venture and go down this path because, X, Y, and Z says I have this information in front of me. But other times where that X, Y, and Z isn't there. You don't have that information, and you're more going off gut feeling and emotion, or or intuition, right? And the ability to think critically may not always exist,
right,
right? And for some people, the expression and paralysis by analysis. They don't make that decision because they're thinking things through. And you have other instances where they don't make that decision because they don't have enough data, regardless if it's still and even though it could still be the right decision for them, right?
right.
So there's a place for critical thinking, absolutely no question about that. But there's times where it can hold us back too, right? Is that
Yeah.
yeah?
So I figured that's where you were going. I just want to make sure that I'm
Right,
answering the right question. Yeah.
right,
So
right.
there, as you mentioned, there are plenty of times when you don't have all of the information.
Right.
And without going too much on a tangent, I do want to mention this idea between like optimistic thinking, pessimistic thinking,
Hmm.
and then people will say, "I'm a realist." I don't. I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a realist. Well, there's an issue with that because realistic thinking isn't like in the middle. Realistic thinking is something that you do in addition to having pessimism or optimism.
Right.
And that's when, as you said, when you don't have enough information available. When you have information available to make the decision,
Yep.
that's when we should all be realists. We
Right.
should be completely realistic about the best decision based on the information we have. And there are plenty of times when we don't have all the information available. And that's where we tend to favor either pessimism or optimism. So, for example, like if you have no idea what the outcome is going to be,
Yep.
like if it's completely random, like there's no statistical data about it or anything, it's like something good could happen or something bad could happen. If you're an optimist, you're going to say, I'm thinking that something good's going to happen because I'm an optimist. Whereas
Right.
pessimists are going to say, oh, I think the bad thing's going to happen. And then there are pros and cons to both of those things.
Sure.
And really, it's not even worth spending a lot of time talking about because pessimism and optimism are kind of genetic and biological in a sense, and we're kind of born with that. There's some environmental component to it, but either it's like everybody if you think about it, you could probably put them on a scale, like, oh yeah, they're definitely more of an optimist, and it's just kind of who they are. So that doesn't change things too much. But when we have information and we have data, we need to use realism. We need to evaluate that data to help us make a decision.
Gotcha.
And sometimes we just don't have it. So it doesn't mean that we're not using critical thinking in that case. We have to acknowledge that we don't have that information. And we
Gotcha.
have to acknowledge that, look, this is complete speculation. And I think
Right.
that's important.
Right.
Not enough people do that. When there isn't enough information available, they say, "Oh yeah, well I still think this." They're going to make this decision
Right.
without the caveat of, "Look, I have to be honest. There's not enough data here. There's not information. I happen to be an optimist. I think this is going to happen, but this is based on speculation and based on like a gut instinct, and that's okay.
Mm.
As long as you're upfront about it, as
Yep.
long as you're not hiding this gut feeling, this sense of
Yep.
optimism or pessimism with facts, with alleged facts or data."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think of it like it's like taking that. So I think like the imagery of you're on a pathway, and the steps in front of you. That's the logic, right? So
Right.
or the information that you have, and you take those steps as far as it can take you, and that's and you're essentially at the end of the path, but you still have to make that next decision, and you're deciding whether to go this or that. Acknowledging, like you said, acknowledging that now you're in that intuition phase, if you will, right?
Right.
There's no more
Right.
logic left, no more information left, right?
Right. Right. And intuition is an interesting topic as well
Sure.
because it's people tend to, when you lack the scientific explanation, when you lack like the information on what something is, you tend to get a little bit mystical about it. I mean, that's like human behavior. That's what we always do. So
Yep.
people think like intuition is some kind of like psychic sense, it's some kind of, the gut feeling or whatever. Really what intuition is, it's the kind of like our unconscious making a decision based on the sum of all of our experiences.
Right.
So a great example of this is like firefighters who go into a building, like they're not critically thinking every step. I mean, they're
Right.
just doing
Right.
it. They
Right.
know, like, I am not opening up this door. They're not like taking the temperature. They're not like, there's all these unconscious signals that through a lifetime of experience, or at least a career of experience that they have, that they know how to make the right decision. This is instinct. This is what they may call like the gut, making the gut
Yep.
decisions.
Yep.
And that's great. It works a lot of times. The problem is many people will completely confuse that, like a true instinct, a true gut feeling. They'll confuse that with just guessing and
Mhm.
an overconfidence that they have in their selves. Like again, another bias, you tend to think you make a lot better decisions than you really do. So you may think, oh, I always make great decisions. So therefore, this decision is going to be great. And it's a good gut instinct, when in
Gotcha.
fact, it's not. And
Mm.
you, because of the confirmation bias, you forget all the misses and remember the hits. So
Yes,
when you
yes.
think back, it's just the way it is. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, intuition could be very helpful, and it could also be very destructive.
Gotcha.
So
Yes.
you need to know
Yep.
the difference. You need to know when you actually are using true intuition,
Yeah.
and think about, well, how could this be intuition? Like,
Hmm.
is this really a decision as a sum of my past experiences, or is this just me throwing darts at a dartboard?
Right. Gotcha. 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 It's very important to know the distinction between the two. I want to go back and look. The topic of AI is a huge one, and we can go on forever. There's no question about that. But I
Sure.
do want to go back to how that impacts and can have an impact, if it does, on a critical thinking ability. I mean, AI is very much a tool. It's personally how I deem it, and that tool can be used for our benefit, and maybe it's used differently by others, and maybe some do replace it as a way of thinking. I feel that you have to be able to make to make AI an effective tool. You have to be clear on what you want it to do, and therefore the output gives you what you're looking for. So I very much see it as a helpful tool. I wonder your thoughts on just AI in general.
I'm extremely optimistic about AI and bullish on it. So
Mm.
that's again, maybe because I'm an optimist by nature. I don't know, but in terms of technology, that's kind of my background, technology, and I was involved in AI
Yep.
the moment it became public. So I'm very much involved in it. And I see from a psychological perspective, when we talk about critical thinking, how it could be very good and very bad. So start with very bad. It's very easy for people to use artificial intelligence to create false information.
Yes.
And if you do not have the critical thinking skills, like the at least a foundation or the base, you will fall for this constantly, and it'll warp your world, warp your view of reality,
Yes.
like to an extent that that we're unfamiliar with in any kind of modern society. So that's the negative. The positive is through artificial intelligence, we can also use that to evaluate information
Hmm.
and give us more credible answers, like based on reality and truth. And when we do, it may be, yeah, we may have like the AI doing the thinking for us,
Right.
but in that process, we learn. We're like, oh wait, why is AI saying this? You know, and it's not, let's say, going along with this conspiracy. Why is it debunking this conspiracy? So you read that and you say, oh, okay, I could see the reasoning. I could see how it did this. So we become more knowledgeable by using AI. It's
Gotcha.
kind of like a teacher in a way. It teaches
Yes.
us,
Hmm.
but also from a more like technical or practical point of view, I could see it being very easy to incorporate artificial intelligence within social media. Virtually every post can be fact checked and
Sure.
with references like in real time.
Sure.
I mean, it could be done now, but it's way too cost prohibitive to do something like that manually. But with artificial intelligence, that would be a snap to do that. So I think overall it is going to be a net benefit to our critical thinking skills.
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, look, hey, it saves a lot of time. I'll tell you that, right?
Yeah,
People, that's a
right.
big one there. Last thing I wanted to ask you about, Bo, and I really appreciate the, all the stuff that we chatted about here. But and so on the list of all the things that you've done and you're doing, author, you're speaker, entrepreneur, you also have humorist in that. Sort of help me explain how the being a humorist, if you will, how this lends to the critical thinking sort of topic, if you will.
I don't think it does. Like, to be honest with you, like, they're just not.
Okay.
Well, if I had to fit it in, here's how I would do it. I would say that one thing I'm very good at is just like it kind of like Seinfeld in a way, Jerry Seinfeld,
Yeah.
like looking at everyday situations and seeing the absurdity, seeing the
Okay.
ridiculousness of it, right?
Okay.
So that's where critical thinking could help.
Okay.
And just like seeing human behavior and how, why, and we do things. I sometimes I feel like maybe I may even be on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, where
Okay.
I view people as like other beings. Like, why are they doing this?
Mm.
I'm not, by the way, but I kind of
Understood.
feel like I am in some of those senses. Um, but and that's the part where critical thinking is. And now the part where humor is kind of separate. Like if you do have a good sense of humor, you could take those situations, you could take those oddities, those absurdities, idiosyncrasies,
Yep.
and you can work it into humor. Now, I did, maybe it was about 10, probably, oh geez, it was probably like 15 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago. I did the stand-up circuit, stand-up
Okay.
comedy, like in the
Okay.
Boston area.
Yeah.
And I wasn't very good at it. Um, I thought like, oh, I'm a professional speaker. I'm a good speaker in front of audiences. I don't
Yeah.
get nervous.
Yeah.
And so this will be really easy. But I realized that public speaking is not stand-up comedy, right? It's very different. Sure, I was comfortable and I was a good speaker up there, but the things I was saying wasn't connecting. And there's probably millions of reasons for that. But what I ended up doing is I found out that kind of my niche was comedic writing, to be able to
Gotcha.
write comedy. And that's when it became funny and people really liked it. So that's what I did. I wrote a book, I wrote a sitcom, and I produced the sitcom and
Awesome.
even did the animation for it, and it's available on YouTube.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, certainly we'll make sure listeners can access that. And we'll make sure all your contact details are provided in our show notes. Bo, this has been awesome. Thank you for sharing your insights and really breaking down critical thinking. And it's one of those things that for some it's naturally already happening and you're not really analyzing the step, but you're
Right.
just doing it because we're natural people, and that's fair, right? Like people just naturally do it, but to understand it a bit more and the insights that you provided, I think are very, very helpful for people. I know again your website is bobennett.com, I believe. Is that correct? Well,
Mm-hmm.
yep, great. So we'll send people there. Anything else you want them to know or connect with? I know again you've got a bunch of stuff on the go, so you let me know if there's something else. Yeah, that
Yeah,
you
sure.
want
If you
people.
want to see all the business stuff I'm doing, my business website is archieboy.com, archieboy.com. And as you mentioned, my personal site with all my books is bobennett.com. And the sitcom I mentioned is called squatspotfitness.com. It's an animated comedy that takes place at a modern gym, like a big Lifetime Fitness or something, but I don't use that. It's called Squat. Uh,
In our lightning conversation with Bo, we discover the indispensable role that critical thinking plays in shaping our beliefs, making well-informed choices, and ultimately leading a purpose-driven and gratifying life. To delve deeper into Bo's wisdom or access his valuable resources, please refer to the show notes for contact information as well as additional insights. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Audacious Living Podcast. If you found today's episode enriching or valuable, we invite you to show your support by liking, following, or sharing your podcast with a friend if you haven't already done so. Your engagement helps us to expand our reach and foster a community dedicated to embarking on a bold and purposeful journey towards a life of audacious living. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.